Call this meeting to order. This is the regular scheduled meeting of the Transportation Public Works Committee. This day, September 15th, 2015. I'm Councilmember Reich. I'll be chairing the committee today. I'm joined by colleagues, Councilmember Gordon, Bender, Palmisano, and Yang. We are a quorum and can conduct the committee's business. We have a full agenda today, including 19 items. They have a series of consent items, public hearings, and a postponement. Given the nature of the audience today, I will go right into the public hearings, beginning with the first public hearing, which is the Southwest Light Rail Transit Project municipal approval of those plans. And just for the public's, we do have overflow for those who wish to go in the other room and sit comfortably. I'll remind everyone that we take speakers in order and they are registered. If we haven't already done so, we invite you to go to the council chambers where clerks are registering speakers. We ask that speakers 1 through 5 line up before the microphone with those subsequent numbers to begin to line up as the room allows. All speakers will be limited to 2 minutes. We ask that all speakers abide by the time limitations, graciously surrender the floor when your time has expired, and that everyone respect the opinions offered by speakers. Also, as a reminder, if you have a written comment or material submitted to the record for this meeting, please give those to the clerk over there or in the hallway. If you want to submit written comments, haven't already prepared those, we do have public comment forms available at the registration table that you may use. With that, we have a presentation. Director Kaki.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Paul Miller, who is our project manager from our Transportation Planning and Programming Division, will start the presentations.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Paul Miller. I'm with the Public Works Department, and I'm the project manager assigned by the city to the Southwest LRT project. Today we're here to talk about municipal consent. We've got a number of members of the Southwest Project Office here that would be available to answer questions following the presentation. But to start with, I'd like to introduce Jim Alexander from the Southwest Project Office, who will do a presentation.
All right, thank you, Paul. I'm Jim Alexander, Director of Design and Engineering for the Southwest LRT project. Just want to say, Mr. Chair and council members, on behalf of the council, I appreciate you having this hearing today and letting me present the project. And so I'll go through this short presentation and then you can have your hearing underway. So a little bit about the project proposed alignment, 14.5 miles, as we've you recall that earlier this summer in spring, we had gone through a cost reduction exercise, which city Minneapolis staff assisted in that process to narrow down the overall costs. We had been at 1.653 billion. It went up to 1.994, and we had reduced 250 million from that number. So we are currently at 1.774 billion for the project estimate. So here's just some statistics about the project: 32 bridges, 2 tunnels, one of them going through the Kenilworth corridor, as we've talked in the past. And all told, there's 15 new stations, and of that, there's 1 deferred station out in Eden Prairie Town Center. And we project a ridership of 34,000 in 2040. A little bit about some of the scope reductions. This mostly affects other cities since we don't have parking rides per se on the line within Minneapolis, but just kind of a litany of different things that went on with the parking rides, where we had changes in numbers in terms of stalls out there. But all told, we're looking at 2,500 or so parking stalls that result in a reduction of about 1,300 from the previous scope. We also had some modifications done at the OMF, the Operation Maintenance Facility, that's currently proposed to be sited in Hopkins. And as I indicated, cost reduction of 250 million there, and retaining 15 of the original 17 stations, with 1 deferred, the Eden Prairie Town Center station. The ridership, you can see from the previous alignment that went all the way out to Mitchell and Eden Prairie, we're about 94% of that ridership, sitting around 34,000, and the corridor length is now 14.5 at 90%, and we estimate about 96% of the jobs that were forecast with that alignment out to Mitchell is now 96% of that going out to Southwest. So I want to focus on the alignment in Minneapolis, and this is the first image talking about Westlake, and essentially nothing really has changed here from the previous image or the scope that we had presented to you last year for municipal consent. Would note that we are still programming to accommodate the Midtown corridor. If that project were to move forward, this project is the alignment for the tracks will accommodate that project. So here we go under the Westlake Street Bridge, and we begin our tunnel that I spoke of that goes through the Kenilworth corridor, and essentially this remains unchanged from what we had presented previously. So in this case, we have freight rail running at grade, and we have trail running at grade with the LRT underneath the trail, essentially looking to preserve the trail characteristics as they are today. We are working through a Kenilworth landscape design process that many of you are probably aware of, that is still ongoing, and we will continue that effort and eventually get those design thoughts and plans into the overall construction package. As we progress northward into downtown Minneapolis, we go under Cedar Lake Parkway through that tunnel. Again, the freight rail at grade, the trail at grade, and then we get up to the channel that crosses the corridor linking Cedar Lake and Lake of the Isles, where we have 3 bridges. So there's a separate bridge for freight, a separate bridge for LRT, and one for the trail. So here we continue to be at grade, running with freight off to the west, going toward the top of the page, and in the green you see the alignment and the trail as we approach 21st, just south of the 21st Street there, and we cross 21st at grade. So here is one change that I want to talk about. That is really about the only change that occurred as part of the scope reduction. As we approach the Penn Station there, you see the skyway, if you will, that links up to Penn Avenue from the station. We'll have an elevator and stair there. We formerly had a bridge structure that would carry the pedestrian traffic from the Cedar Lake Trail or the North Cedar Lake Trail as it gets further to the east, or sorry, to the west, and would have crossed over freight and LRT and landed just south of the alignment. As part of the scope reduction, we have looked to take that bridge out and have an at-grade crossing. And as we show it here, we have about a 20-foot wide trail, if you will, that would handle the bicycles and pedestrians just to the west of the station, and then crossing freight. So another thing that we did here is we essentially flopped the station over, pivoting off of the skyway, the piece in yellow, to have that crossing right at the station. We have found just previous experience on our Hiawatha and or the blue line and the center corridor, the green line, that if we have pedestrians or bicycles, we want to have that crossing close to the station, just from a safety perspective and an operational perspective, because the trains will be slowing down and coming into that station here. One thing I did want to note, that we are working with staff on, with the park board and the city staff as well as the county, of looking at maybe more of a Z crossing, where we would cross LRT as you see it here next to the station, but perhaps bring that trail down to the west a bit before we cross rail. We see that as a safer mechanism to allow pedestrians and bicycles to pause before they cross both modes. That lane, if you will, would accommodate bicycles and peds. We'd have fences on both sides, and we look to have that be about 20-foot wide. So that's something that's currently being contemplated that is not shown in this image, but want you to be aware of that. So as we continue to leave Penn and go into downtown Minneapolis proper, we are running along the BNSF Wayzata subdivision track as we proceed under 394. And then we come into Van White, relatively essentially unchanged here from previous scope that we have presented to you in the past. We have the linkage up to Van White with elevator and stair, and we also have the trail bridge replacement to go over to Bryn Mawr Meadows. So we continue on and go under 94, and as we start to get closer to Glenwood, we need to navigate upward and get up out of that rail trench, if you will. And so we get up on structure, and we cross Glenwood at grade on a new bridge, and we traverse over to make our way over into Royalston, and then eventually make our way over into Target Station. So as part of the municipal consent process, there's a state statute 473.3994 that says that as the Met Council is developing these LRT plans, we need to seek consent on the rail alignment, the station locations, those primary elements of the project. So that's why we're here before you for your consideration on this alignment we're presenting today. And talking about the physical design components, that links to that statute, just the litany of elements that are part of this project. And as we look at them, I won't necessarily go through them in detail. Be glad to take any questions as I conclude here. And maybe just a little bit about the schedule. We look to conclude this effort October 11th. As it's currently programmed, if Minneapolis Full Council still looks to hold their consideration vote for the action on the 25th, we would conclude on that day. So that's how this is laying out right now. So in terms of next steps, we are not done by any means, and we will continue to engage city staff as we advance the design of the stations and the streetscape. Like I indicated, the landscape piece of the Kenilworth corridor is an important aspect of that, and we'll continue to engage all the project partners as we bring these designs up to 100%. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to take any questions if needed.
Any questions for the presentation? Seeing none, thank you. And we will open up the public hearing. We will take people in order as they're signed, and we will begin with, we're joined by our colleague over at the Capitol, Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I don't take this lightly. I think this is the first time in my legislative career that I've spoken before the council, so it would be a heartfelt issue for me to do that. I think I spoke to the Planning Commission about the Herc incinerator at one time, but this is my first time before you, and so I appreciate that, and would request that in your deliberations on municipal consent that you include some discussion of freight rail safety issues. This is something that I have spent quite a bit of time on over the last year and a half, prompted in part by the explosion in Quebec a couple of years ago, where there was significant loss of life, but primarily when I read about the oil train explosion 20 miles west of the Minnesota border at Castleton, North Dakota, late in 2013. So quite a bit of my efforts at the legislature have been focused on ensuring that crude oil trains are transporting this very dangerous cargo safely. Thanks to some of my constituents, the issue of ethanol transportation was on my radar last year. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about why this is important and things that I've learned over the last year since you've addressed municipal consent previously. And that is that studies have shown that ethanol has similar explosive qualities as crude oil. And so when we're looking at these unit trains of ethanol that are traveling through the Kenilworth corridor and downtown Minneapolis, you should understand that we're dealing with a hazardous, highly flammable, hazardous material. Think about it as similar to the Bakken oil trains that are passing through our city. And so once you get that in your mindset, then we have to be very, very adamant about ensuring that public safety is addressed as these trains pass through. So as a result of those efforts, we did include ethanol safety in legislation this past year that was passed in 2015, where we actually called directly on the state to analyze preparedness and impacts of public safety from transportation of ethanol by rail. So this is now on the state's radar. We have about 19,000 residents that live in an evacuation zone in case there was an accident or an explosion of an ethanol train in this corridor in downtown. So many people are affected by this. So let me just conclude with 3 points that I want to make, and I hope that you'll consider. Number one, just to reiterate that ethanol is a hazardous material. It is coming through these areas that are densely populated. I was hoping, certainly was my expectation, that the supplemental draft environmental impact statement on the Southwest project would include more discussion of this issue and really look at some of the safety concerns. That has not happened. I testified on that issue on the record and sent a letter to the Metropolitan Council imploring them to take this issue quite a bit more seriously. And finally, this past summer, we had legislation in 2014 where we asked railroad companies to update their spill response plans. And the railroad that's primarily involved in Kenilworth, TC&W, has actually resisted public disclosure of those plans. I find that very problematic. And this just happened over this past couple of weeks over the summer. So given these 3 factors, I would simply request that when you address this issue, that you include a conversation and discussion about ethanol train safety, because this is, I think, one of the only, if not few, areas where we have rail and or passenger rail and light rail co-located with these kinds of trains. And so given that situation, I believe that you should be looking at this question in the context of the resolution that you're about to discuss. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Any questions? No, thank you very much for your leadership and work on this. And I believe that our intention to have a resolution that is in conjunction with our action before us today that will address the very points that you raised and then some.
Okay, I really appreciate that, Mr. Chair and council members. Thank you so much.
Representative. Moving down the list, we have Art. Just state your name and address for the record.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be able to address council members. I'm a resident of St. Paul. I live in Highland Point. I made the decision to move based on family access and on the fact that as I age, I'll need a 1-floor condo instead of a 3-story townhome. But shortly after I made that decision, Commissioner McLaughlin pushed forward with the co-location of freight and light rail through the Kenilworth corridor where I had lived. Why do I stay involved? It's a matter of conscience. As Representative Hornstein pointed out, running hazardous freight through urban areas is a hazard to many residents of Minneapolis. Alternates should be looked at. It should go back to the drawing board. There should be no pride of authorship of having carried a project this far, and I've been involved since 2006. Just before I made my move, I was a past president of the Sydenham Neighborhood Association. 300,000 people will be in danger from both Bakken oil trains and ethanol freight trains on the TC&W line. There have been 24 accidents in the past couple of years where freight has been derailed, and in many cases it's been followed by explosions and death. Unrelocated freight rail, a promise that was made by the Hennepin County Regional Railroad Authority 16 years ago, maybe 17 now, is a broken promise, as Mayor Hodges has pointed out to Commissioner McLaughlin. It should be relocated, and alternatives for the light rail should be looked at, including running it down the Midtown Greenway or out the Burlington Northern Corridor to St. Louis Park's West End, which is already a highly developed area and has greater prospects than the Lake Street area of Minneapolis. Thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Hornbutton, before you leave the microphone, we need your name and address for the record.
Excuse me?
We need your name and address for the record. We need you to state your address publicly for the record.
Okay. My address, it's 1800 Graham Avenue, Unit 417, St. Paul, Minnesota, 55116.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have John Shorrock. And then I'll call out some of the people who will be subsequent, just so you can be prepared. Kathleen Stanley, Richard Adair, and Craig Westgate. But please state your name and address for the record.
Good morning. My name is John Shorrock, and I'm from 3145 Dean Court, Minneapolis 55416. Thank you for allowing the opportunity to speak to you. I'm a resident of Calhoun Isles, and I'm very concerned. We are at the pinch point for the Southwest LRT, which is the most difficult point to engineer. Before the city gives any consent for the Southwest LRT, I'd like to ask that the City Council states in writing that it would do to mitigate the following safety issues. We face at Calhoun Isles, which affects the lives and livelihoods of people who live there. Now, the first one is the oil and gas trains weigh around 130 tons each for each car. And there's roughly about 50 cars that go down that rail, which is 6,500 tons of explosive material. That's a lot to explode. As well as moving, the trains stand in the corridor for hours, and they have been known to stand there for 16 hours. And they all wait for a signal because it's only a byline. The other main line is a BNSF line, which they have to wait for. Now, this is a hazard statistically waiting to happen, as during construction and afterwards, the cars could collapse the tunnel because they're very heavy. The leaking glass cloud that the cars, actually, they're not really sealed. They leak. It's just like your car. In your gas tank in your car, it leaks. If you leave it in the garage long enough, you can smell the gas. And so with the LRT, which has high tension 700 volts co-located with these trains, that gas cloud could be exploded. It's just
Mr. Shorrock, I need you to
just a
wrap
little
up,
fact.
please. Thanks.
So they have the high tension wires, and they are a hazard when you co-locate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll call in order. Kathleen Stanley.
My name is Kathleen Standing, and I live at 2817 Drew Avenue South, Minneapolis. The light rail project, as it is presented, is a bad deal on every respect for the city of Minneapolis. Kenilworth was never first choice for the location of light rail, but rather the third or fourth choice when considering service to the people of Minneapolis who really could use rapid transit as a means of equity. No co-location was at the heart of agreeing to this choice. Mayor Rybeck got duped. He said yes to Kenilworth, but the Met Council reneged on their promise. On safety, due diligence for the risks of co-location was the responsibility of the Met Council. In my opinion, the whiteboards used at public meetings, which was a representation of the DEIS, were a whitewash. They had everything covered, yet they hardly addressed the real dangers of co-location to riders and residents if a train carrying ethanol or other flammables exploded. The plans for construction with business as usual, having freight trains running close to construction where the landscape and soil conditions are compromised, present increased chances for a plan for disaster. Use of parkland. The plans for the 21st station show saving a few trees in the corridor and planting 2-inch diameter trees. It would take 20 years to get any shade and beauty in that corridor, and that would put us out to 2038. Long time for any beauty. The light rail project is being presented as a bad deal on every account for Minneapolis. Make your children and grandchildren proud and vote no for municipal consent to the project as it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Richard Adair, if you could come forward and state your name, address for the record, followed by Craig Westgate and Paul Petchke. Thanks.
I am Richard Adair. I live at 200 Upton Avenue South in Minneapolis. First, I'd like to say, I have two things to say. First is that the route that we've presented with here is the result of 10 years of open public planning. And a change in this route at this point would be disrespectful to the many, many people who've participated in this process over a long period of time. It's not perfect, but it's how democracy works. Second, I'd like to look at the effect of light rail transit on our city lakes from a different perspective. How much automobile exhaust we put into the atmosphere. Many of us believe that global warming is an environmental disaster that dwarfs the legitimate safety and environmental concerns raised by people who oppose this project on the basis of its location. The essential task of our generation, it seems to me, is to transition from a carbon-based economy. Among other things, we need to learn to live more densely, and we need to give future generations an alternative to using the automobile to get around. Our very survival may depend on making this adaptation. Safety is very important, and I really appreciate Representative Hornstein and our other elected representatives in ensuring that safety can be done. But safety is primarily the responsibility of our engineering professionals. I've been keeping records of ice cover on one city lake for 40 years. It's a hobby of mine, and it's clear that the ice is coming in later and leaving earlier. More ice-free days means more evaporation, more absorption of solar heat. City lakes will be warmer with more algae and a worse habitat for native fish species. More importantly, the recent drought and famine in East Africa, where many citizens of Minneapolis have relatives living, is thought to be an early manifestation of global climate change. In some places where it doesn't rain, people starve. Let's do some quick math. 34,000 rides per weekday on this light rail line times 261 weekdays per year is 9 million rides. Add a few more on weekends and you have 11 million rides a year on a highly energy efficient form of transportation. That's a lot of cars not putting carbon into the atmosphere. The Minneapolis City Council has an opportunity to endorse a piece of infrastructure that can really make a dent in this problem. Please consider the global consequences of your vote.
Thank you. I'll now call Craig Westgate, followed by Paul Petchke. Please state your name and address for the record.
Good morning. My name is Craig Westgate. I live at 3523 St. Paul Avenue. I'm also the chairman of SIDNA. I'm also on the CAC for the city of Minneapolis, and I'm also on the Section 106 committee. So this controversy, this topic has taken about 6 years of my life. And so you've got a lot of really smart people and educated people that you'll hear facts, real facts about rail safety, as Frank has stated. You will also probably not hear things about soil and sound mitigation, of which there is no money in the Southwest Light Rail budget to take care of the after effect of what's happened to this. And that was just recently that they came out with that. You will hear about ethanol. And as many cities across the nation are banning the transportation of ethanol within their city limits, not only are we creating a new line, we're going to put people in an electric train underneath it. That's something to really think about when you think about safety, rail safety. We can talk about the environment, how they will be digging down as much as 48 feet into the water table of our city's theme, the Chain of Lakes. And even when this is complete, they will be pumping water out of this tunnel into our soils forever. We think of Knox Avenue and what a nightmare that was. And that was a very small little piece. What kind of damage is left? Well, from being on some of the 106 committees, I can tell you that the historic Grand Rounds, they can break down into 50 feet increments. The historic Grand Rounds is not 150 feet. It is the whole part of the Grand Rounds. And so when we sit there and talk about how the Met Council and how the project office, not the Met Council, but how the project office has been minimizing so many of these concerns of ours,
it becomes a frustration. It becomes a passion to some degree. So what kind of damage is left? Well, this is where we look at certain things, and we look at the construction of a small building that's being built in our neighborhood right now, the Trigg site. I think many of you are aware. They have tried 3 different forms of foundation that now they're on their 3rd form. Their cost overruns have gone up 350% for the foundation. Is that something that you're willing to take? Well, I'll tell you right now. According to the consultant that they hired, risk and issue management assessment, this is from their own outside consultant that Dayton hired from Accenture.
Mr.
Project
Westgate,
risk
we need you
management
to
role
wrap
is
up.
not defined. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Paul Peschke, followed by Bob Brockway.
Hi, I'm Paul Petchka. I live at 3116 Dean Court, Minneapolis, 55416. I live in the Calhoun Isles Condominium Association. The construction at the nearby Trammell Crow project has raised many concerns about the feasibility of building the shallow tunnel in the southern portion of the Kenilworth corridor. There's great concern that homes will be taken and that the railroad, the bike path, and the LRT will all wind up at grade. The Met Council has identified 2 methods for installing sheet piling for the shallow tunnel, a vibratory hammer or a hydraulic press. The Trammell Crow staff conducted various trials using vibratory hammers to install sheet piles. Damage occurred in the surrounding area and caused abandonment of this method. Even at 180 feet from the site, our association incurred damage. This method must be rejected as it will cause varying degrees of harm to the unique residences in the Sidney neighborhood. The Trammell Crow staff also stated unequivocally that the hydraulic